it's like, you know, the period that's covered by the music in this volume is a 10-year stretch during which I was primarily working in this quartet format with myself, Rudresh Mahantapa on alto saxophone, Stefan Crump on bass, and various drummers, 3 different drummers, Derek Phillips in the late 90s and into 2000, 2001, and then Tyshawn Sori for a couple of years, and most recently Marcus Gilmore, who I've been working with ever since 2003, I guess. So, you know, that was when he joined the group when he was a junior in high school. That was fun. But every step of the way, it's been, it was real, you know, we were really oriented towards discovery and challenging ourselves, and you know, working within the language of the tradition of the music, but also trying to bring something to the table that was at least new to us. It wasn't about creating something that the world had never seen before, but really the sensibility of discovery that mattered to me. And also about making music that felt good and that took the listener on a journey. So often the way I would structure the music was to build process into the music. So it was never just take a chorus or something like that. It was really like, okay, here are these raw elements, now build something with them. You know, that was kind of more the idea. And particularly Rudresh and I had a lot of connection in that sense of seeing things in similar terms. You know, you could start from some very basic building blocks, and that could be a stimulus for improvisers to do something that keeps giving back. You know, that you know, basically you could use the ingredients of the music as generative tools for improvisation too. And we weren't the first to do anything like that. You know, that's all basically part of the tradition of creative music. You know, we're both very inspired by Coltrane, and I'm deeply influenced by Monk. I mean, I'd say like between Monk and Coltrane, that kind of covers a lot of possibility there. And in particular, I remember the first time that Rudresh played as a guest with my trio when I still lived in California. And I guess it must have been 97 or 98. And I heard a sound in there that was, to me, at least reminiscent of the kind of Coltrane-Monk axis. It wasn't that we were nearly as interesting or as good or anything, but that there was that, I heard similar elements at the foundation of the music, you know, that seemed like there was potential there. And in particular, I remember it was on some simple tune of mine. I think it was Circular Argument, which is a little trio. It was a trio tune that I'd written that was basically a blues, but I had him play on it. And it just reminded me of hearing Coltrane playing Twinkle Tinkle live at the 5 Spot. Some of that stuff that was like, okay, this was never meant to be played on a saxophone, for one thing. And then hearing those ingredients kind of transferred to the saxophone, and then sort of like what it brings out of the whole ensemble as just like those elements sort of impelling the improvisers was really inspiring to me as a sound. And like I said, we weren't anywhere close to the level of what those guys were doing, but it was, I guess I just heard a similar kind of grain of inspiration in there. So that was sort of the sound that I had in my head around 97, 98, when I thought, well, let me try some more music like this. Let me just kind of try to push this a little further. And at the same time, of course, also, both Rudresh and I, well, we'd been playing a lot as a duo, and we had both been on our own terms and in our own respective kind of independent ways, dealing with elements of Indian music. For me, mostly rhythmic elements from Indian music, and for him, at the time, mostly melodic ideas from Indian music and timbral ideas, kind of transferring that to the saxophone and stuff like that. So, you know, so I started really trying to push those ideas in earnest into the music. And particularly, this was like, for us, it was part of becoming ourselves, you know, part of growing up, I guess you could say, was really embracing this aspect of who we were and who we are and our heritage without compromise or without trying to say like, well, we're doing this because it sounds Indian, but more like we're doing this because it's part of our creative path, you know, of becoming who we are. So for example, there's a song on panoptic modes, which is the first, so you know, this book spans 4 albums worth of material for this same ensemble. So the first album was Panoptic Modes, and that was music that started coming together in '98, and the album came out in 2001, I think. So that material contains some of, I mean, well, it sort of, it crystallizes a lot of the influences. So if you look at configurations, for example, this is a piece that's on Panoptic Modes. I think it's a second piece on there. And I remember I went to India in 2000, and I went with Steve Coleman, and he and I kind of did these study workshops with Umayal Param Shivaraman, who's an incredible South Indian percussionist, a legend and a teacher and a great performer. And prior to that, Rudresh and I had done a project with Trichy Shankaran, who's also one of the great living legends of Mridangam, the South Indian drum. So between those two guys, I'd learned a lot about putting rhythms together. So Configurations was in fact written originally for the trio of me and Rudresh and Trichy Shankaran. And it has a rhythmic phrase that lies across 3 cycles of 7 beats. But that rhythmic phrase is not 7s, it's 5s and 6s. So it kind of cuts across, it's a cross rhythm essentially. And when you hear it by itself, as the song starts, you just hear the figure and you don't hear the ground. And then when the ground comes in, and then the figure comes in across it, you hear it in a very different way. So I was just interested in that, and basically the way that these kinds of cross rhythms can create this dialogic space for rhythm and for improvisation. You know, so that, but then also, if you look at the harmonic content, it's a bunch of major chords separated by major thirds, you know, so it has this Coltrane influence too. And also the way things are voiced was very influenced by Monk, a lot of dyads and stuff. And then also the way I found, like the best way I found to kind of improvise on it was to think about Bud Powell. You know, and particularly like him playing on Un Poco Loco and some of that stuff. Because he had a way of sounding, I mean, it's a lot of material, a lot of information in his lines, but it also has a real relaxation in it that I was really striving to achieve at that point. I really wanted to get to this, I wanted to get past the structure, I guess, to the point where the structure was not something I had to get across to the listener, but just something I could be in so that I could actually create something, you know. So that was really, I mean, that's again the spirit of a lot of this music is like, there's a lot of structural detail, but the structure is meant as a stimulus for us as improvisers to get somewhere else that's perhaps inside ourselves, perhaps outside of ourselves, you know. But it's sort of just meant as a, I think the easiest, you know, like the easiest example that you can think of from the history of this music is giant steps, you know, like that was not easy music to play, obviously. And even Coltrane himself, you can hear him if you listen to the whole CD's worth of outtakes that comes along with that Atlantic box set. You can hear him in the beginning talking about it and saying, wow, you know, he says, wow, I'm not gonna improve this. I'm not gonna be able to tell any stories on this music. I'm just trying to make the changes. And then one of his bandmates says, well, really, if you make the changes, that'll tell him a story. Which is interesting, huh? You know, like basically the fact of putting yourself through those trials and then achieving something is its own story. And that's not to say that it's all there is. And I think, you know, when Giant Steps is one thing, but then when you hear what happened to Coltrane as a result of Giant Steps, like basically if you listen to Love Supreme, or Transition, or Interstellar Space, that's all a direct path out of, you know, past Giant Steps. So I was interested in pushing myself like that, like, well, he did that, so what's my excuse for not doing that? You know, for not doing something similar in terms of just pushing myself with the basic elements of music.